This is like the week of technical challenges with this really amazing software that's not as amazing as I was hoping. But we're here, and I have Dr. Gabrielle Lyon with me, and we are going to answer your questions from the summit, the Fix for Female Hormones. And we've got quite a stack. And I have to say, I don't know, Gabrielle, if you ever made it over to check out all the questions or the comments that were on your interview, but everyone loved it. It was great. And it's been interesting this week as I'm kind of paying attention to the conversations and what people are talking about. I feel like there's just so much that these women can learn from you and how you approach your protocols. And I do want to say, because this is coming up a lot. So Dr. Jay Davidson was really popular. And he actually didn't ask me anything on Monday. And he talked a lot about parasites.
Yeah.
And so there's been lots of people that have been asking about parasites. He has a protocol he recommends for dealing with parasites. I know this is something that you find a lot with women and that you are routinely checking for because the parasites can really impact someone's ability to lose weight. So we are going to start Ask Me Anything with Misty Williams's Ask Me Anything question because it just seems to be an aggregate of everyone else's questions. But I would love for you to talk to us a little bit about parasites, their connection to weight loss, and why it's so important that people check on parasites.
Yes. So first of all, let's talk about what a parasite is. So it's a parasite, which is this amoeba or worm or some kind of organism that doesn't want to kill you. It wants you to live so that it can live within you, right? So it's not something that is deadly, but it essentially feeds off you. Why does that matter? Because it sequesters all your nutrients. And even more importantly than that, it creates this systemic inflammation. And what I found is that women that tend to be very weight loss resistant, of course, there's this hormonal aspect, but I would say, probably almost 90% of the patients that I see have come back with parasites.
Wow, 90%.
Probably 90%. Once you treat that, it seems to lower their systemic inflammation. I mean, I have one patient that she's tried everything for probably 20 years. She lost 55 pounds.
So tell us about treating. First of all, how does someone know they have a parasite? My understanding based on our interviews is it seems like it's very hard to test because it depends on the life cycle of the parasite and all these other things. So it's hard to test. You do have a way that you check for it, but not everyone's going to be visiting you in your clinic. So whatever insight you could share on the testing side would be really helpful. And then talk to us about a good protocol. What does that look like?
One of the biggest things initially for a parasite is when you think about a parasite, it's a life cycle. It's not that I eat this food and then I feel bloated. It's I'm eating perfectly. I ate chicken and vegetables and I still feel terrible, but I felt really great on that a week ago. And it's not related to menstrual cycles. It's not related to any of these other things. It's really this cyclical experience that doesn't seem to be triggered by anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And they can't figure it out. They do get gas and bloating depending on what it is, but they may get flare-ups of eczema. I see that a lot when I see whipworm. Also, people that eat a ton of sushi and travel, say, Africa, any really kind of, or third world country, right? And you're eating the food. And if you can get it in the US, so it doesn't really matter where you're going, but you can get it. So it's really that cyclical kind of nature and the thing that you've tried everything and nothing has worked.
Yeah. So talk to us about a protocol for parasites.
Yes, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'll ask after.
In terms of testing, I've found that a lot of the stool tests miss it, right? Because we talked about the life cycle, but also for whatever reason, and I don't have any evidence to support this, the RNA testing, the RNA or DNA testing, the probe tests can still come back negative. So actually I send them to an old school parasitologist. When I say old school, I mean this guy is probably 900 years old. They do a rectal swab, they look at it under a microscope, and he determines what bug it is. And then he's a tropical medicine doc, and he treats them with medication. I have not found a ton of success in my practice by trying to treat a parasite naturally. When I say parasite, I mean Entamoeba histolytica, whipworm, hookworm, the more intense the bug, the longer they've had it, I found that natural approaches don't seem to work in my clinical experience.
Mm-hmm. So Dr. Davidson recommends, I'm going to probably butcher it, I think it's Mimosa pudica. Am I saying it right? It's an herb, and he does extended protocols with people, 6 months or longer. Do you have experience with that particular herb? And just tell us, I mean, I'm not trying to like put you guys against each other. I just want people to know what
There's
kind of options there are, right?
I've thought about this a lot, and I'm really glad that you've asked this, because by the time people get to me, they've been suffering for a really long time. I don't want them to take them through 6 months of suffering. I'd rather have them treated within a month. The treatment, I can get them treated within 2 weeks, and they're remarkably better. Of course, it depends on other illnesses or other things happening, but I prefer personally in my practice to really get the job done and to get it done efficiently. Is it more harsh on the body? Probably, but I think in the long term, that's better.
Yeah. So, is there, so I'm assuming you're using some kind of pharmaceutical when you say that you're not treating with herbal methods? So I
actually have the tropical medicine physician treat them. So he's up to date on whether it's paramycin, whatever, depending on the bug. Yes, for sure.
So if someone is saying, okay, if I want to explore this route, what are they looking for in a doctor, practitioner, or, tropical medicine person? How do you find someone like that? And then really what hard. Kinds of, it's hard.
It's nearly impossible.
Okay. So, so do you want to, can you share who your person is if people want to look him up?
His name is Dr. Kevin Cahill.
Okay.
And he is in New York City.
Okay.
He's amazing. People come from all over the country to see him.
Okay.
I haven't found anybody else. I wish that if anyone knows of anyone, I would love to know, because it's a very particular, these guys, he's probably 75.
Yeah. And you need to find someone else.
I mean, and I actually asked him to teach me. And, he said, well, Dr. Lyon, I've written 25 books and I've had, done multiple things. So
no such treatment animal, huh? Okay. All right. Well, that's helpful to know. So if someone is exploring dealing with parasites, you obviously highly recommend this guy. Is there like a plan B treatment? If you can't get to the tropical medicine guy in New York City, what would you recommend?
That's a really great question. I would see if there is a tropical medicine physician locally. There are people that have studied infectious disease.
Okay. Alrighty. Well, that is our parasite update. We just kicked right off with a very yummy, delicious conversation. Okay.
That's a great question, and really important, because the concept is that that these things are super challenging, and in functional medicine, we tend to miss this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
We look at the testing, and then sometimes the tests aren't accurate, and there's nothing that we can do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's actually something that does come up that I want to ask you about, because a lot of people in the community have been asking about this. Say you're looking at cortisol, for example. We obviously know the role of cortisol and all this hormone stuff that women experience. And so they'll do a salivary cortisol. It'll render one set of results, and they'll do a serum cortisol, blood cortisol test, and it says something different. There's this frustration with like, which test do we go by? How do we know what to do with these results? I know you've experienced stuff like this, and I kind of have an idea of what the answer is, except I'm not a doctor. And so I would much rather it come from you.
So it's interesting. Blood cortisol is good. It's a spot treatment, right? So it's a spot number, and that changes. That totally changes depending on the time of day that you take it, and it's variable. And it's not just the cortisol that you're looking at, but you want to look at cortisone and the metabolites of cortisol. I tend to use the Dutch test. We started to use the Dutch test in my practice to determine cortisol levels, where we're looking at. Again, it's not just the immediate, but it's also the metabolites of cortisol. And again, it's really important to whatever it is that you're using, you should use consistently. You should use the same method. So you're tracking it, right? So it's all about tracking the data.
Yeah. So a lot of times what they're doing with labs, just to give context to that for everyone, is we have optimal ranges, and, we've offered that free download of a lot of functional optimal ranges so that you feel empowered to understand a little bit of what you're looking at when you're looking as a patient at your own test results. But what Dr. Lyon is saying is that the results between your tests, like, you take your tests one time, 3 months later, you use the same lab, and you're comparing like against like, so all the other variables are consistent. That data is very, very meaningful and can give you an idea of what your trajectory is in lieu of, the optimal ranges or whatever. You're really trying to get an idea of what's going on in your own body and measuring that super consistently. It's like if you're tracking your weight, you're not going to use 3 or 4 different scales to do it.
Exactly.
You're always going to get on the exact same scale every single time. Yeah. So, okay. So when clinically, I hear a lot of doctors poo-poo the serum cortisol test. They don't find it to be particularly useful. Sometimes you find doctors that's all they have because of how their practice is set up. Even functional medicine doctors, especially if they're insurance based, they can't get their patients to do the salivary, so they have to make the serum work. Why don't you tell us, ideally, which I think you just did, but just to reiterate, ideally, if someone's really concerned about tracking this, my assumption is your recommendation would be to do the Dutch test.
Yeah.
And tell us what information we're going to get on the Dutch test, because many practitioners on this event have recommended the Dutch test.
So the Dutch test will give you, so typically when you get blood work, all the people listening or watching have gotten their blood work, and it'll just say, at the beginning, depending on how it's laid out, DHEA, cortisol, estrogen. But it's really the metabolites. So it's the active or inactive forms. So I'll give you myself, for example. I was exhausted, but my cortisol looked normal. So I did the Dutch test, and what it showed is that I was actually metabolizing all my cortisol. So essentially I had nothing. And I would have never known that had I not looked at the whole picture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
I did something.
Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go. I'll ask in a second.
So it's not just what's in the blood, it's how much you're clearing versus how much you're keeping. Which is important. Yeah.
Several years ago, I did the Genova Complete Hormone Panel. I don't know if you've ever used that test.
I have not.
It's a 24-hour urine test. It was the first time that I feel like I got a snapshot of exactly what was going on with my own hormones. And it did what you described. It shows kind of over a 24-hour period how all of your hormones are cascading. And what I learned from that test is I wasn't methylating at all, like zero zip, no methylation. And I was also able to see, some other metrics with my own hormones in that test. What I know now, I think I did that test in 2013. And I actually have some genetic things where I'm prone to having methylation issues, What I know now is that right before this, you guys have heard me talk about my 45-pound weight gain. I actually had the mercury fillings removed from my teeth without a dam. They just drilled it out, and that mercury went all over.
Oh my God.
And yes, that's what happened. And so that accounts for my 45-pound mysterious weight gain that was actually a mystery until about 6 months ago, which I lost.
Okay, so then you did.
Well, we actually talked about this a little bit, Gabrielle. I can't remember if it was in our interview, though, or just our private conversation. So I did HCG. I went on hormone therapy first and was able to lose about 15 pounds. And then I went on HCG to lose the rest. Weight stabilized beautifully until last year. And then last year, my weight, I could not keep it constant for anything. I was less than 1,000 calories a day. I was doing Zippo carbs. If I did do carbs, it would be like some sweet potato, and the scale would just go up every single time. And that's when I had new lab work done. I was hypothyroid. That thyroid stuff really helped. And I've actually been on a heavy metals detox protocol. I'm doing the Desbio heavy metals detox protocol right now. It's about a 2-month program. And I'm noticing a difference I think I'm on day 18 or 19 of a 60-day program. And I'm noticing a difference in how I'm carrying weight too. I'm traveling right now, so I'm not getting on a scale, but I can tell I'm shrinking. And I think that it's, it's getting rid of the metals, like legit getting rid of the metals. And I've been taking my thyroid meds, but I really lowered the dose. on my thyroid meds, and I suspect I need to go get my labs done as soon as I get back to Austin next week. But I actually suspect that my thyroid might be working fine. I may be able to come off thyroid support. So that's really exciting. But I wish I could say I knew it was from heavy metals, and then I just did a heavy metal detox and all the weight came off. But I had to hack it other ways because nobody could figure it out, for years until, recently just putting all that together and getting everything tested and starting this protocol. So anyway, enough about me, but it's crazy what can happen. Yeah.
And I think, it's interesting that we're talking about cortisol. I'm sure that totally blew your cortisol through the roof. But I think that it gets a bad rap because we need it, right? So we need that get up and go, that fight or flight. You need it to be able to train, right? A normal training response is a release. So I talk a lot about resistance training, high interval training. You require cortisol. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that chronic stimulation or the inability to metabolize it.
Yeah. And there's a lot of women who are talking about dealing with fatigue and like they want to know what's going on with their cortisol. And I'm gathering from all these conversations that we're having that there's other things that are really important to evaluate. It's not just, you don't look at your cortisol and then you're able to then diagnose and treat the fatigue. Like that's just one marker, but there's so many other things that help paint this picture of, the underlying causes of the fatigue. It's not just a cortisol issue.
Totally agree. And I think that when we look at things in piecemeal, it doesn't get good results. Right. It is certainly looking at the whole picture for sure.
Right. Okay. So we have a question about these macros.
Yeah. My favorite topic.
Right. So, on the summit, actually, I think it's on your page, your talk page on the summit. Sherry said, was it Sherry? No, Mary said, you recommend 90 grams of protein a day and quote the research on MTOR. Dr. Joseph Mercola recommends 20 grams of protein a day and quotes the research on MTOR. Are you aware of this? Do you know the difference? Why he's quoting it one way, you're quoting it another way, or why he's interpreting it one way and you're interpreting it another way?
I'm pretty aware. So I think it's really important that you vet your sources of information. I have to say that is of primary importance, that you have to know where the data is coming from. So the literature is very clear that protein is necessary for maintaining muscle mass and stimulating muscle protein synthesis. What we also know is that protein stimulates something called mTOR, which is mechanistic target of rapamycin. That is a effect that is a cascade event that signals muscle protein synthesis. It is different in all of the different tissues. And if it is overstimulated chronically, they think that it's linked to cancer. The biggest stimulator of mTOR is insulin. Insulin is largely stimulated by carbohydrates. So the concept of lowering your protein, which does stimulate mTOR, is the equivalent of saying the other thing that really stimulates mTOR is exercise. So if exercise and protein both stimulate mTOR in the muscle, which we know builds muscle and keeps it healthy, if you say that you don't want to stimulate mTOR, then that's the equivalent of saying that exercise is bad for you. It is not a correct interpretation of the data. And there's 30 years of research out there that shows in terms of good health, longevity, aging, that muscle and protein is essential and stimulating mTOR is a necessary component of that and not a bad component. When you talk about chronic overeating, multiple feedings of carbohydrate, and you're overstimulating mTOR, that's a problem.
Yeah. If you guys have a question for Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, yes, you can drop it in the comments. I see a couple of you asking if you can drop your comments. And yes, I am monitoring. I also have been aggregating all the gazillions of questions that you guys have been asking. So we've got lots of questions queued up already because I am listening to everything that you're saying. And yeah, if you have a question for Dr. Gabrielle, definitely drop it in the comments. All right. Next question is from Sherry. Can you give the macros per meal that you recommend? You said 30 grams of protein per meal, but how many grams of fat and carbs per meal? And was there a total number of calories for women to shoot for each day in regard to weight loss?
I love this question. This is very helpful for people. Let's think about diet and macros per meal as kind of building on a painting. The foundation and minimum is 30 grams of protein. You could easily go up to 50 grams of protein per meal. Depending on if you have carbohydrate intolerance, right? So if you're not super active, you have excess weight, you don't have great insulin sensitivity, your carbohydrates should be as low as possible. What I mean by as low as possible, you can start with a 1-to-1 ratio of, say, 30 grams of carbohydrates to 30 grams of protein. You do not want to go over 40 grams of protein per meal. Anything over 40 grams of protein the body has a hard time metabolizing for the most part, and you begin to store body fat. So you then increase your insulin levels. So you want to keep insulin level as low as possible. There's also another important point. And in terms of fat, I would say 15 grams. Again, it's very individual, but the baseline structure would be 30 to 50 grams of protein, 30 grams or less of carbohydrates, and 15 grams of fat or less. The majority of your calories should come from protein.
Okay. So majority comes from protein. I remember seeing another comment, and I don't know if I grabbed the question, but it's coming to me, so I'm just going to ask it. They talked about your liver. How do you know that your liver is strong enough to be able to metabolize 30 grams of protein a meal? Is there a correlation there? Is there a certain barometer of health that you?
No.
Okay. You want to unpack that for us?
You could. So it's a myth. That's actually a myth. Protein is not bad for the liver. There is a nitrogen group on protein, which the body, if you are healthy, can absolutely metabolize. If you're thinking about what would be much more detrimental, it would be carbohydrates. And if you have too much fat, you immediately store fat. Protein has a high thermal effect of feeding, which means that it creates a lot of energy expenditure and it actually increases fatty acid oxidation. It is absolutely a myth that protein is bad for the liver. Your liver, if you are healthy enough, should be able to detoxify. In fact, you use the amino acids for detoxification.
Okay.
Make sure that your fluids are high, right? And you should have no problem with that.
Okay. Lots of women are asking about hormones and testing. And obviously there's been many, many conversations we've had around the whole testing thing. There are docs that advocate testing, docs that say, forget about the testing, go by your symptoms. And they have kind of a different way of measuring certain things because testing results can be inconclusive for a lot of the deeper work. So one of the things that I think has really kind of captured the imagination of women in our group is this idea of some kind of baseline testing to get a sense of where you are in your body. Serum lab testing, I didn't hear anyone saying the serum lab testing wasn't advocated for. I think there's some basic measurement. I know that Dr. Keisha Ewers really advocates for when you're talking about hormone replacement therapy, how important it is to actually test your hormones.
Totally.
So a lot of people are asking, how can I have my hormones tested? And then what are the optimal ranges? So on the optimal lab tracker that I worked with Dr. Chad Yarborough over at Maximize Genetics to put together, we left off hormones because there's so many caveats to how you read your labs in relation to the optimal ranges. So I would love for you to unpack this and talk about it a little bit, because I mean, I think the women are like, this is a hormone summit. You gypped me. You didn't put the hormone really data in there.
Women are like snowflakes. They are totally different. An estrogen of 150 for me or an estradiol of 150 for me might be normal, whereas, I don't know, 100 is normal for you. So I think that depending on the lab, everyone's using different labs. I think that that's a really hard question to answer, frankly. I think that it's nearly impossible. Everyone is so individual. People should get a Dutch test. You should look at a Dutch test and you should look at serum. You should do it a week before your period. And then you should evaluate. It is definitely symptom-based as well. I know that that's not a great answer, but that's everyone.
So let's talk to the perimenopausal woman who is not having consistent periods.
That's a
So a week before your period is like not a thing. I'm in the boat. I'll use myself as an example. Last year I had 3 periods all year long. Last year I was 42, 41, 42.
Congratulations.
3 periods all year long. Thanks. This year, in a 60-day period, I had 4 periods. And this year I've had like 5 or 6 because I'm doing like deeper healing finally and seeing amazing results. So my periods are coming like 4 periods in 60 days was like culture shock for me because the last couple of years, I didn't have that many periods all year long. So like to say, go a week before your period. Why don't you go a little, what is a perimenopausal woman? And lots of women have wrecked periods where it's not on a consistent schedule to be able to see a week before.
So you could do a 28-day saliva test just to get a sense of what's happening. So that's one thing that I would do. And then the other thing is I would definitely do a Dutch test and do the best you can. Just do the best you can. I would love to augment this conversation on hormones, if you don't mind.
Sure, I'd love
to talk about something that nobody has mentioned, and that is hormones' effect on the muscle tissue.
Okay, great. Do it.
And why that generates weight gain. So in perimenopausal women, when their estrogen levels are low, they tend to gain weight, right? We know that muscle is the largest organ in the body. Because muscle is the largest organ in the body, it's very interesting that there are estrogen receptors on the skeletal muscle. When there are estrogen receptors in the skeletal muscle, as someone goes through menopause, there's something called a GLUT4 transporter, which is what brings the sugar from the outside of the cell into the muscle, right? So it transports into the muscle. That also becomes less sensitive. It actually downregulates. So the muscle tissue itself becomes more insulin resistant. So anyone who is who is beginning to have declines in estrogen, it is essential that they begin on a much lower carbohydrate diet. So that is very key. And 60% of all the protein you eat gets converted to carbohydrate just based on the biochemistry of it. So if they switch their thinking. Anyway, I just wanted to say that because it's really important and it's very interesting. Testosterone gets a great rap for muscle, but estrogen also has effect on muscle.
Right.
And thus body composition. And I do a ton of weight loss. I mean, 50% of my practice is weight loss.
Yeah.
And metabolism.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Let's talk about intermittent fasting and the frequency of meals. So Maria asks, you talk about 30 grams of protein per meal 3 times a day.
Yep.
But what if you're only eating twice a day? Is how many times you stimulate the muscle growth more important than the total amount? Or would 90 grams during those 2 meals be okay in a day? And can you supplement with BCAAs if they come from a good source?
That is a great question. So you require 30 grams to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. You actually max out the process the higher you go. So say you go up to 50 grams. That is actually perfectly fine. And in fact, some people in my practice eat 50 grams per meal, 50 grams twice a day, and they might have 1 or 2 snacks. Again, this is the minimum number. This is the minimum amount of protein that I recommend. I don't think that they would need to do a branched chain amino acid in the middle of the day. I say I like to stimulate muscle protein synthesis 3 times a day. I've just found from practical experience, years of doing this, that has a better effect on body composition. The other thing that I'll say about that is what is even more effective is utilizing your own internal clock. So those people that are, say, early risers, early birds, I have them begin feeding earlier and ending them earlier. Those that are night owls, I try to go with their own inherent clock and push them later in the evening. Okay.
That's great. I actually noticed for me, I would probably naturally be a night owl if I hadn't dialed in my sleep. I mean, I was naturally a night owl before dialing in my sleep. And I actually feel like I function better if I eat earlier and stop eating earlier. And there is so much airtime in the ancestral health space. There's a lot of people talking about like a later eating window and eating later. And my N=1 just doesn't function as well.
Right.
When I eat later. I do better if I start eating earlier in the day. And I start light on breakfast. I don't start with like this huge meal necessarily, but if I start eating earlier and then finish by 4 or 5 o'clock, I'm perfect for the day. So everyone is different in that
Totally
regard.
different.
Mm-hmm. All right. So here's another hormone question for you. Is seeing a functional medicine doctor or integrative health practitioner the only way to get all of your hormones tested?
No, of course not. No. I'm sure that there are, I mean, OBGYNs that will do it. I mean, they might
Mm-hmm.
not do it in the way that they're very evidence-based. And I think that the evidence is emerging more and more for functional medicine in the way that we test. So I think finding a good integrated practitioner, those that are, say, traditional Western medicine, but with an eye on more functional, I
Mm-hmm.
think that, and they're typically covered by insurance, I think that's a total possibility.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What value do you think that a hormone test result would have to a woman who's not considering bioidentical hormone replacement therapy?
That's a good question. What benefit I think data is always important. I think that you can't make good decisions without information.
Mm-hmm.
That is just in terms of my practice. I think that it's really hard to make educated decisions, even if you're not going to do anything about it.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of talk about estrogen dominance and the EGP2 ratio. I think one of the reference bits that I've collected over the years is that you want your EGP2 ratio to be 300 to 1, I think, if I'm not butchering that. But why don't you talk a little bit about estrogen dominance? Like, what is it? What do you want ratios to look like? And help people understand clinically, like, what they need to be thinking about as they're evaluating treatment overall, if estrogen dominance really is a thing for them.
So I think that for estrogen dominance, when you think about estrogen dominance, one of the things is that you look at obviously elevated levels of estrogen, but in terms of initially, even so, if we're talking about what it looks like in the body, it looks like fat gain here, it looks like fat gain in your hips, it looks like fat gain in your butt. So with that being said, I mean, like the first thing that you do, of course, is get your blood. Do it a week before your period. And of course, in some practices like mine, you use the Dutch. And then you identify, where they're at. In terms of the ratio, it's, I tend to not use it very much, actually, in my practice. I just look at how they're metabolizing it, and I look at the Dutch, and I see, what is actually happening within their metabolism for me. And then I give them something like DIM to help metabolize them. Always make sure that their digestion is good so that they're excreting everything. That's super important.
Yeah. So will you just give us a rundown of the various women's diseases or issues that have an estrogen dominant component to them?
For estrogen dominance, the diseases, I'm not
I know endometriosis is one. Endometriosis is one where estrogen dominance shows up a lot. Are there any other women's issues like that?
Of course, terrible PMS. So when someone comes in and they're saying, "Oh, I have breast tenderness, and I just feel terrible around my period," then immediately I think of estrogen dominance or really heavy periods. It's really just in terms of, for my practice, when they're trying to lose weight, it's I have terrible periods, I feel awful, or endometriosis. I don't, off the top of my head, I think that's
the main ones. So estrogen dominance, the ways that I personally, just in my own experience, and I want you to fill in the gaps because I'm sure there's lots that I haven't done, that I personally have worked with my doctor to handle my estrogen dominance, is to, number one, get more progesterone. Definitely supplemented a lot of progesterone. My progesterone was low anyway, but especially when they looked at the ratio, it was low.
So how much progesterone did you start with?
Am I on? I don't remember how much it was in the beginning. I think I'm on 100 to 125 milligrams a day right now. I don't remember what my initial dose was back then. I'd have to look it up. But progesterone was one way. And then another thing was doing DEM, like what you just described. There might be some other things. I just want women to know what the options are so they can explore these with their doctor and actually initiate some of these conversations. What happens a lot of times is we go into the doctor's office and it's whatever the doctor knows or whatever's on their mind at the time is what comes up. And so a lot of things get missed. Like with my doctor, and I love my MD in Austin, but I take everything in. Like I go in and say, here's what I think we should do. And here's the protocols I've researched. And, she's super supportive. I'm working with someone else that's helped me with my Epstein-Barr and that's helping me with my heavy metals and all these different things. That did not come from my MD, just so everyone knows. I have a couple of different people that I'm working with, but my MD is incredibly supportive, but I do not rely on her to come up with my entire treatment plan and tell me everything to do. And in fact, I don't rely on any of my practitioners to do that. I don't think that it's responsible of me. They don't have enough time to know my entire history and everything as thoroughly with the kind of complex issues that I'm dealing with. So I take a lot of responsibility. I try to make sure that I remind them, remember that I'm dealing with this and this and this, and I only have one ovary, So I'm super, super proactive in my own care, and I've been able to get results that way. And so that's why I'm asking the questions that I am, especially around this estrogen dominance thing, because I want women to have some tools and perspectives to go in and have really informed conversations with their doctors.
Yeah. I'm not sure if it's well accepted in the medical literature in terms of estrogen dominance.
Okay.
So I think that.
Talk about that a little bit, just so we know.
I mean, I just think that Western medicine, and I've trained Western, there's nothing wrong with it. It's wonderful. It's just, it takes time for things to actually have evidence behind it. So I don't know if physicians typically are incredibly open to that. They might say, oh yeah, whatever, estrogen dominance.
So, not even really, it's not an accepted thing maybe for mainstream docs.
I don't know how it is in terms of OBGYN and if they feel that is, a real thing. I don't know. Was that your experience with your physician?
Well, I did work with a GYN in Austin in Nashville, that was the traditional doctor. It was the only person that I could find. I actually went to an integrative doctor in Nashville and had a terrible experience with him. He was not open to anything, and he would at least run my labs for me. Right. But I couldn't get him to acknowledge anything that I was experiencing, which was completely disappointing after everything I'd heard about integrative functional medicine doctors, So she was the first person that I felt like actually supported me with a protocol that moved the needle. Obviously, the hormone therapy. Not only did I lose weight, but I started just feeling better in a lot of ways. My brain started functioning better. My sleep started improving. Just a lot of things got better once I went on bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. So she was supportive. I think a lot of my ideas and things I would ask about, she probably thought I was cuckoo, and she just let me talk, and she just told me what she was willing to do. Right. So that was my experience with her. Now I'm seeing a functional medicine doc who's an MD, but is trained with the Institute of Functional Medicine. And so it's a completely different kind of experience. So
maybe some of them do use a ratio of, I don't know. I mean, they could use ratio 200 to 1 and say that there's an issue there, or they could treat symptomatically. Yeah. I tend to treat more symptomatically for my patients, and they get so much better because I think it's really challenging when you just look at the labs. I mean, I have tons of patients that I'm like, do you have any energy? Their thyroid is really low. They feel great. Yeah. So I think that's just,
and that's been a pattern with a lot of our docs, by the way, especially our female docs. They will look at labs, but they also really pay attention to the symptoms, and will do the same.
I think that's really key. So even if a patient has a ratio of, less than 200 to 1 or whatever it is, but they feel good, I don't know.
I'm not going to mess with it.
I'm not inclined to treat that.
Yeah.
It means that there may be another reason for their weight gain, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I found that it's not always just the hormones. So I think that we focus a lot on the hormones, but fat cells create an inflammatory cascade. There's medications that I use that decrease the inflammation in the fat cells. They're more off-label, but there are other things. It's not just the estrogen, progesterone, and cortisol that generates weight gain or makes weight challenging to come off.
Mm-hmm. So I have another question about that I've been seeing in the community. that's around this whole fat idea. So why are men often able to eat more fat and lose weight? And with women, it's a mixed bag. Some women eat more fat and lose weight. Some women eat more fat and get fat.
In my practice, I've only seen that happen. I have never seen women do really well that are relatively athletic or getting into exercise or moving do well on a high fat diet. I think that there is more testosterone and I think more androgen activity. Because of that, I think that they just tolerate fat better. I think that a high fat diet would never be the place I start with a woman ever.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't make metabolic sense if you think about it. So fat doesn't actually affect muscle tissue. If we were to say what is the one thing that maintains body composition, you would say it's muscle tissue, right? Muscle is the most metabolic organ in the body. It is responsible for 80% of your insulin-dependent glucose disposal. So if you were to focus on one thing, on body composition and lowering adipose tissue, you would focus on muscle.
Okay. All right. Noelia asks, she's asking the liver question. I kind of beat her to the punch here. We'll see if there's anything else that comes up. 30 grams of protein 3 times a day. How about those that have a congested liver? A healthy liver can digest 35 grams per meal. Intermittent fasting and autophagy conserve protein in the body, so there is no such need to eat that much protein. What are your thoughts?
What is a congested liver? I'm not sure what that is. And what else would you replace those calories with? So the liver is designed to metabolize branched chain amino acids. That's its job.
Yeah.
The carbohydrates are what cause fatty liver, not protein. So unless you're fasting, you could fast. That's fine.
Yeah.
But you're going to have to eat. I mean, maybe you can be a breatharian, aeritarian.
Yeah.
I've met those. They tried it for a little bit.
Yeah.
So I think it's really about not being dogmatic in terms of belief and just really thinking what makes sense. Right?
Yeah.
So we know that we have to maintain healthy muscle tissue. The liver is the primary organ. It is designed to metabolize amino acids. The muscle is designed to metabolize branched chain amino acids. We know carbohydrates in excess are very toxic to the liver. It causes fatty liver.
Yeah. Okay. Maria asks, the intense workouts and fasting elements, if you have adrenal fatigue, should you do this?
If you are exhausted, let's just say total exhaustion, then I think you have to refill your tank and see how you recover. So if you rest enough, I think that if you're lifting heavier weights and not high intensity and you give yourself time to recover, that is much more beneficial than long cardio. It's also much more beneficial than doing nothing. So walking doesn't count as exercise. I don't count that as exercise. If you are totally tanked out and your adrenals are done, I don't recommend necessarily pushing your cortisol higher and depleting you with HIIT. But I do think slow is steady and strong.
Okay. Someone asks a very unique question. They have one kidney.
Wow.
And their doctor has recommended that they eat less protein because they have one kidney. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I think that my initial instinct is that if your kidney works well, you can get away with one. I don't know if eating moderate protein, which 90 grams is not high, would affect that one kidney. My aunt, Liz Lipsky, actually has one kidney, and her protein intake is probably around 90 grams, and she's fine. But I would check with a nephrologist. I've never heard that because that's not having kidney disease. That's just having one filter. But I would ask your nephrologist. Yeah.
Alrighty. This has been awesome. I could probably go through here and miscellaneously pull another 10 questions and keep you for another hour, but I think we're probably at a good stopping point. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing with us. This has been awesome. And I hope everyone gets a chance to listen. I am going to go update the status here with the questions so that you guys can kind of see what the questions are that we covered. And I will keep an eye on the comments, Gabrielle. I don't know if I've added you to the Facebook group. I'll make sure you're in it if I haven't. I'll take a look at any questions that come up over the course of the next few days. The ones we've done Monday, for example, are still getting lots of engagement, lots of new questions. So
amazing.
I'll try to keep a log and then just see what I can do to support you guys in getting answers. But this is fantastic. I really appreciate that you come at this from the perspective of a woman, and I love the space you hold for women, and I love the work you've done around women's health and really helping take all this functional medicine knowledge that we have and figuring out how to get it to work for women. I know that we're more complicated and we need more voices like you in our space. And so I'm delighted to have you, and thank you so much for sharing with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody.